Julian Croft, a man whose net worth was tracked by global markets like a weather system, sat in the plush leather of seat 1A and understood, for the first time in his life, the concept of absolute failure. His company, Synapse Dynamics, could predict stock market fluctuations with 98% accuracy using quantum computing, yet he, the architect of this empire, could do nothing to stop the piercing, relentless screams of his own 6-month-old daughter. Her name was Lily, and for the last 4 hours, she had been waging a war of sound against the pressurized calm of the transatlantic flight to Zurich. Every passenger, from the irritated celebrities in first class to the huddled families in economy, was a prisoner of her distress. Julian had tried everything logic dictated. He'd analyzed the feeding schedule, the diaper's status, the cabin temperature. He'd offered a bottle of precisely warmed formula, which she rejected with a violent thrash of her head. He'd walked the aisles until his legs ached, bouncing her with a mechanical rhythm that only seemed to amplify her cries. The flight attendants, once sympathetic, now approached with tense, professional smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They offered him heated towels, plastic toys, and whispered suggestions, each one a fresh reminder of his inadequacy. He was a man who could command boardrooms with a single glance, who could dismantle corporate rivals with flawlessly executed strategies, but he was being defeated by a 7-pound human he was supposed to protect. The other passengers had long abandoned politeness. A famous actress 2 seats away had draped a silk scarf over her head, a dramatic gesture of suffering. Across the aisle, a steel magnate was muttering loudly to his wife about the entitlement of people who can't control their offspring. Julian heard every word. The shame was a physical heat on his skin, worse than any hostile takeover he had ever faced. Because this wasn't business, it was a referendum on his humanity. 6 months ago, his wife, Elena, had placed Lily in his arms for the first and last time, her voice a fragile whisper. "She's your problem to solve now, Jewel." Then she was gone. Now, this trip to Zurich wasn't for business. It was to see a specialist, a last-ditch effort to understand the rare autoimmune disorder that the doctors in New York had given up on. Lily's crying wasn't just colic, it was a symptom of a constant, invisible pain. And her father, the man with infinite resources, was powerless to stop it. He was failing his daughter. He was failing Elena. The weight of it was crushing him, right here at 38,000 feet, surrounded by the silent judgment of strangers. He looked down at Lily's face, red and contorted, tears streaming from her tightly clenched eyes, and his own composure finally shattered. He didn't make a sound, but a single, hot tear traced a path down his cheek. That's when a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see a flight attendant, her expression grim. "Sir," she began, her voice low but firm. "There's someone who thinks they might be able to help." Julian was ready to wave her away. Who could possibly help? Another passenger with useless advice? A doctor who would ask the same questions he'd already answered 100 times? But behind the flight attendant, a figure emerged from the curtain dividing first class from the rest of the plane. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 17, tall and slender, with an air of quiet intensity. He was a black kid, wearing a simple gray hoodie and worn-out jeans, a stark contrast to the tailored suits and designer labels surrounding them. His backpack was old, one strap held together with silver duct tape. He met Julian's gaze not with pity or judgment, but with a startling look of focused understanding. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them, the broken billionaire and the boy from economy, with the screaming child as their desperate, wailing center. The boy didn't speak to Julian. He spoke to the flight attendant, but his eyes never left Lily. "Her cry," he said, his voice surprisingly deep and calm, somehow cutting through the noise. "It's not just frustration. There's a sharp pitch in it, right at the end of each breath. It's pain." Julian froze. In all the months of sterile doctors' offices and clinical diagnoses, no one had ever described the sound of his daughter's suffering with such simple, terrifying accuracy. The boy took a hesitant step forward. The steel magnate across the aisle scoffed. "Oh, for heaven's sake. Now they're letting children handle it. But Julian didn't hear him. He was looking at the boy's hands. They were long and graceful, hands that looked like they belonged to a musician or an artist. And in that moment of complete, soul-crushing desperation, Julian Croft did the one thing he had never done in his entire adult life. He gave up control. He looked at this stranger, this kid from another world, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Because the logic had failed. The money had failed. Now, all that was left was the unthinkable. The boy, whose name Julian did not yet know, moved with a quiet deliberation that was both unnerving and deeply calming. He didn't rush. He approached the seat, knelt so that he was at eye level with Lily, and simply watched her for a full 10 seconds, his expression one of intense concentration, as if he were listening to a piece of complex music. He completely ignored the disapproving glares and the suffocating tension in the first-class cabin. In his world, there were only two people, himself and the screaming child. Then, he looked at Julian and asked a simple question that carried the weight of a final plea. "May I?" Julian didn't trust his own voice, so he just nodded, shifting Lily's weight slightly in offering. The boy didn't take her. Not yet. Instead, he held his hands out, palms up, a few inches from her flailing body, allowing her to feel his presence without the shock of a direct touch. He began to hum. It wasn't a lullaby. It was a low, resonant note that seemed to vibrate in the air, a sound so steady and pure that it felt ancient. He held the note, and then slowly, he introduced a second, slightly higher tone, creating a simple, perfect harmony. Lily's screams, which had been a constant, sharp staccato, began to falter. The rhythm of her panic was being disrupted by this new, unexpected vibration. The boy moved his hands closer, and with the lightest possible touch, placed one finger on the center of her chest and another at the base of her neck. He began to tap, a soft, syncopated rhythm that matched the harmony he was humming. It was a strange and beautiful counterpoint to the harsh mechanics of the jet engines. 1, 1, 2, 3. 1, 1, 2, 3. It was a waltz for a broken heart. And then, the miracle happened. The screams subsided into desperate, shuddering sobs. The sobs softened into whimpers. The whimpers faded into ragged, exhausted breaths. Finally, there was silence. A complete, profound, and holy silence that filled the entire cabin. 200 passengers held their breath, afraid that a single cough might shatter the fragile peace. Lily's eyes, which had been squeezed shut for hours, fluttered open. They were the same deep, stormy gray as her mother's. And for the first time since they'd boarded, they weren't filled with terror. They were filled with curiosity as they focused on the young man's face. She wasn't just quiet. She was calm. A wave of relief so powerful it felt like a physical blow washed over Julian. The tears he'd been holding back now flowed freely, silent tracks of gratitude and grief. He looked at the boy, who was still humming, still tapping that gentle rhythm. "How?" Julian's voice was a raw whisper. "How did you do that?" The boy finally looked up, his focus shifting from the baby to the father. He offered a small, shy smile. "My little brother, Theo," he said softly. "He doesn't talk. He has a sensory disorder. The world is too loud for him. He lives in a storm. I learned that you can't shout over the storm. You have to find a rhythm inside it. You have to give it a new harmony to follow." He explained it with such simple clarity that it made every high-priced specialist Julian had consulted sound like a fool. "I'm Marcus," the boy added, as if remembering that introductions were a normal part of human interaction. "I'm Julian," he replied, feeling the absurdity of the statement. The name meant nothing here. His billions meant nothing. He was just Lily's father. "Why are you going to Zurich, Marcus?" Julian asked, his mind reeling. Was he a prodigy in child psychology? An intern for some new-age medical practice? Marcus's gaze drifted for a moment, a flicker of hope and fear in his eyes. An audition, he said. The Zurich Conservatory of Music. It's for their composition program. It's the only one I applied to. The audacity of that statement, the all-or-nothing risk, struck a chord deep inside Julian. He understood that kind of gamble. It was the same one he'd taken when he'd sunk his entire life savings into his first algorithm. Your parents must be proud, Julian said, trying to imagine the kind of support system that produces a kid like this. A small, sad smile touched Marcus's lips. It's just my mom and me now. And my brother. She sold my dad's old guitar to help pay for the ticket. Said it was time his music gave someone else a future. The story landed with the force of a punch. This trip wasn't just a hopeful long shot for Marcus, it was a sacred debt. It was the final inheritance from a lost father, converted into a single chance by a mother's sacrifice. Julian looked from the worn duct tape on Marcus's backpack to the sleeping face of his own daughter, and the chasm between their two worlds felt both infinite and non-existent. They were both just trying to honor the people they had lost. Both gambling everything on a hope for the future. She's asleep, Marcus whispered, his voice full of gentle satisfaction. He showed Julian how to position his hands to continue the steady, comforting pressure. The key is consistency. Her body needs to trust that the calm is real. As Julian took Lily back, her tiny body warm and relaxed in his arms for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he realized the entire first-class cabin was staring. The actress had taken the scarf off her head. The steel magnate was watching with an expression of stunned disbelief. The collective hostility had evaporated, replaced by a shared sense of awe. They had all just witnessed something that defied explanation, a small moment of grace in a world of chaos. And Julian knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this encounter was no accident. The universe had just sent him a message, delivered by a 17-year-old boy in a gray hoodie. With Lily sleeping soundly against his chest, a warm, solid weight that felt more reassuring than any financial report, Julian gestured to the empty seat beside him. Please, he said, his voice regaining some of its familiar command, though it was now softened with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Sit. Don't go back there. Marcus hesitated, glancing back toward the economy cabin as if it were his natural habitat, a place he was required to return to. Sir, I shouldn't, I'm Julian, he corrected him gently. And you should. Sit. Marcus finally slid into the seat, the supple leather sighing under his weight. He looked small and out of place next to the polished mahogany and brushed steel of the first-class suite, yet he possessed a stillness that made the surrounding luxury feel strangely superficial. For a few minutes, they sat in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the hum of the engines and Lily's soft, even breathing. Julian found himself watching Marcus, studying the way his hands rested on his knees, the long fingers perfectly still, yet humming with a kind of latent energy. Tell me about your music, Julian said, breaking the quiet. What kind of pieces do you compose? Marcus's expression lit up, the shy caution in his eyes replaced by a quiet passion. I try to write what things feel like, he began, struggling to put the concept into words. Not just emotions, but systems. The rhythm of a crowded city street. The harmony in a forest after it rains. The dissonance of a hospital waiting room. He paused, then looked at Julian. My mom says I build cages out of music. Cages for chaos. To make it beautiful, or at least understandable. Julian felt a jolt of recognition. Cages for chaos. It was the most elegant description of his own life's work he had ever heard. Synapse dynamics didn't just predict markets, it imposed order on the terrifying randomness of human economic behavior. He and this boy were in the same business, just using different languages. One used algorithms and quantum processors, the other used melodies and harmonic progressions. And your brother, Theo? Julian asked softly. What does his storm sound like? Marcus's gaze softened. It's not one sound. It's everything at once. The hum of the refrigerator, the birds outside, the fabric of his own clothes, it's a wall of noise with no dynamics. I write pieces for him that have a clear, simple melodic line, something he can hold on to when the rest of the world is screaming. As Marcus spoke, the steel magnate from across the aisle, a man named Henderson whom Julian had known for years, finally saw his opening. He leaned into the aisle, his voice a booming, artificial baritone. "Julian. Good to see you, my friend. Tragic news about Elena, just tragic. But I have to say, your Q3 numbers on the Synapse expansion were a work of art. A work of art. We should talk about the new European data regulations. I've got my team pulling their hair out." Henderson's eyes flickered over Marcus for a split second, dismissing him as one might a coat rack or a piece of luggage, before returning his full, fawning attention to Julian. Here it was. The world Julian knew. The transactional pleasantries, the networking disguised as sympathy, the relentless churn of capital and influence. For his entire adult life, this had been his language, his arena. All he had to do was nod, engage, and the familiar comfort of his old self would return. He could feel the entire cabin watching, waiting to see how he would handle this. The billionaire and his temporary help. He looked at Henderson's expensive, predatory smile. Then he looked at Marcus, who had respectfully fallen silent, making himself small, expecting to be ignored. He thought of Elena, who had always called these men empty suits. He thought of her telling him, "You can acquire the whole world, Jewel, but you'll never create something as valuable as a single, honest song." And in that moment, Julian made a choice. He gave Henderson a polite but unmistakably final nod, then turned his body fully toward Marcus, creating a deliberate, unbreachable wall between his world and Henderson's. "You said you find the harmony in systems," Julian said, his voice clear and carrying, leaving no doubt as to who held his attention. "What's the harmony on this airplane?" Henderson's smile froze, and he slowly retreated back into his seat, a flicker of confusion and insult in his eyes. The actress 2 seats away hid a smile behind her hand. Marcus, however, looked stunned by Julian's public act of allegiance. He thought for a moment, his head tilted. "It's a struggle," he said finally. "The engines are a constant drone, a C-sharp, but they're fighting the vibration of the fuselage, which is a G. It's a tritone. The devil's interval." He smiled faintly. "It's designed to be unsettling. But the people, their breathing, the quiet coughs, the rustle of pages, that's the grace note. A quiet A-flat, trying to resolve the tension." Julian stared at him, completely mesmerized. This kid didn't just see the world, he heard it, deconstructed it, and understood its hidden mechanics on a level Julian could barely comprehend. Henderson saw markets, Marcus saw music. And for the first time, Julian understood that one was infinitely more complex and beautiful than the other. He had spent his life building a fortune, an empire of numbers and code, believing it was the ultimate measure of a man's worth. But in the past hour, a 17-year-old boy with nothing but a borrowed future and a deep understanding of harmony had created more value than Julian's entire company could generate in a year. He had created peace. He had silenced pain. He had given a father back his hope. A new plan began to form in Julian's mind, an algorithm of its own, but one based on a new set of variables. This wasn't about charity. This wasn't about a reward. This was about talent acquisition. It was about recognizing a paradigm-shifting force and ensuring it had the resources to change the world. He was no longer thinking like a grateful father. He was thinking like the founder of Synapse Dynamics. And he had just found the most valuable, undiscovered asset on the planet. As the plane began its long, graceful descent into Zurich, the sterile announcement from the captain crackled through the cabin, signaling an end to their suspended reality. Soon, the doors would open, and the world, with all its rigid structures and social divisions, would rush back in. Julian felt a surge of panic that was entirely different from the desperation he'd felt before. It was the fear of a CEO about to lose a once-in-a-lifetime deal. He couldn't let this boy, this impossible combination of talent and character, simply walk out of his life and vanish into the crowd. Falling back on the only tool he had ever truly trusted, he reached for his checkbook. "Marcus," he said, his voice a little too eager, the executive taking over. "I want to thank you. Properly. I want to fund your education. All of it. The conservatory, your living expenses, whatever you need to support your family. Just, name a number. I'll write a check right now. Consider it a signing bonus for a very bright future." He said it with the casual confidence of a man who could move mountains with a pen, believing it to be the ultimate, irrefutable solution. He expected gratitude, perhaps tearful acceptance. He did not expect what came next. Marcus physically recoiled, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. A shuttered expression came over his face, one of polite but profound disappointment. He shook his head. "No, thank you, sir." The refusal was quiet, but it was as solid and unyielding as a wall of granite. Julian was so taken aback he literally had no response. The word "no" was not something he heard often, especially when it was attached to an offer of life-changing wealth. "I don't understand," Julian stammered. "This is your future. This is for your family." "That's why I can't take it," Marcus explained, his voice laced with a gentle but unbreakable dignity. "My mother didn't sell the guitar so I could get a handout. She sold it so I could have a chance to earn my future. What you're offering is kind, but it's an answer. My journey, my music, it's supposed to be about the questions. If I take your money, the story ends. The song is over before I've even written it. Her sacrifice has to mean something more than that." The word struck Julian with the force of a physical impact. He saw it instantly, his money wasn't a key, it was a cage. A beautiful, gilded cage that would rob this young man of the very struggle that had forged his genius. He felt a hot flush of shame. He, who had just admired Marcus for his depth, had tried to solve him with the most superficial tool imaginable. He had seen a prodigy and treated him like a problem. Elena's voice echoed in his memory, a conversation from years ago as he celebrated closing a multi-billion-dollar deal. "It's easy for you, Jewel," she had said. "You think everything has a price tag. But the things that really matter are the ones that can only be earned." He had never understood what she meant. Until now. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, the roar of the reverse thrusters signaling the finality of their arrival. Passengers began to stir, the spell broken. The world was back. Julian had seconds to fix his mistake. "You're right," he said, his voice low and urgent as people began reaching for their overhead luggage. "I'm sorry. That was arrogant. It was the only way I knew how to think. Please, let me start over." He looked Marcus directly in the eye, stripping all the executive authority from his voice, leaving only raw sincerity. "Forget the money. Forget the checkbook. I have a problem, and I think you, and only you, can help me solve it. I want to hire you." Marcus looked confused. "Hire me? For what? I'm not a nanny." "No," Julian agreed quickly. "You're not. You're an analyst. A specialist in complex acoustic systems." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "My daughter's illness. The doctors are looking at it with scans and blood tests. They see cells and proteins. I look at her charts and I see data points and anomalies. We're all deaf to the real problem. But you heard it. You heard the pain in her cry. You heard the dissonance." The doors of the plane hissed open. The moment was almost gone. "I want to hire you as a consultant for the duration of my trip here," Julian said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Your audition is your priority. But in your free time, I want you to be with us at the clinic. I want you to listen. Listen to her, to the machines, to the doctors. I want you to tell me what you hear. I'm offering you a job, Marcus. A professional engagement. Your insight, your unique perspective, has a value that I am prepared to pay for. Not as charity. As a fee for service. It was a completely different proposition. It wasn't a gift that would erase his journey, it was a challenge that would honor it. It gave Marcus a way to accept help without sacrificing his pride, a way to earn the money his family desperately needed by using the very gift he was trying to build his future on. Marcus stood in the aisle, his old backpack slung over one shoulder, the river of first-class passengers flowing around him. He looked at Julian, a man who had everything but the one thing that mattered. Then he looked down at Lily, sleeping peacefully in her father's arms, her life a fragile, unresolved chord. He had a choice. He could walk away, preserving the purity of his own quest, or he could step into this man's chaos and try to compose a new kind of music. The music of healing. Marcus looked at the stream of passengers hurrying to deplane, their faces set toward customs, baggage claims, and the anonymous rush of arrival. Then he looked at Julian, a man whose forward momentum had been completely arrested, a titan of industry brought to a standstill by the cry of a child. In that moment, Marcus made a decision that had nothing to do with music theory and everything to do with the simple, powerful harmony of human connection. "Okay," Marcus said, his voice steady and clear over the cabin announcements. "I'll do it. When do we start?" The relief that flooded Julian's face was more profound than any stock market rally. For the next 5 days, Zurich became the backdrop for the unlikeliest of partnerships. Marcus went to his audition first, walking into the hallowed halls of the conservatory with nothing but his talent and the weight of his mother's sacrifice on his shoulders. He played his heart out, his compositions telling stories of the storms and the silence he knew so well. Afterward, he would meet Julian and Lily at the sterile, white clinic nestled in the Alps. There, he did exactly what he was hired to do. He listened. While world-renowned doctors showed Julian complex diagnostic images and genetic charts, Marcus sat on a small chair in the corner of Lily's room. He closed his eyes and simply absorbed the sonic landscape, the insistent, arrhythmic beep of the heart monitor, the low, oppressive hum of the air filtration system, and underneath it all, Lily's shallow, tense breathing, even in her sleep. After 2 days, he finally spoke. He met with Julian and the lead physician, Dr. Alleman, a woman with a brilliant but rigid mind. "You are all trying to find the source of the noise," Marcus said, choosing his words with the care of a composer. "But you're ignoring the quality of the silence. She has no sanctuary. The environment you've created to save her is also hurting her. It's a constant, low-grade sensory assault. For a child in chronic pain, that's torture." He proposed a radical idea. He worked with the clinic's technicians to recalibrate the machines, changing the piercing beeps to softer, tonal chimes. He created a custom soundscape for her room, a continuous, low-frequency composition that mirrored the rhythm of a healthy, resting heartbeat. He called it Theo's Lullaby. It wasn't a cure, but it was a beginning. For the first time, Lily began to sleep for hours at a stretch, her tiny face peaceful, her breathing deep and untroubled. The doctors were stunned, watching their data charts show a dramatic reduction in her stress markers. They had been fighting a war with medicine, Marcus was building a foundation of peace with music. On their last day in Zurich, 2 envelopes arrived at the hotel. One was for Marcus, a thick, formal letter from the conservatory offering him a full scholarship. He had done it. His dream was his. The other was for Julian, containing Marcus's invoice for acoustic and sensory consulting. Julian presented him with a check for an amount that would not only repay his mother but would secure his family's comfort for years to come. Marcus took it without hesitation, his eyes shining with the profound satisfaction of a debt honored and a wage earned. On the flight home, Lily slept in her bassinet, cocooned in the gentle, harmonic soundscape playing from a small speaker. Julian and Marcus sat side by side, no longer billionaire and boy, but collaborators. In front of them was a notepad, and at the top, Julian had written a title, The Elena Project, a new approach to pediatric healing. They were designing a new foundation, one that would fund research into the intersection of art, technology, and medicine. As the plane crossed the ocean, carrying them back to a future that was now irrevocably changed, Julian looked at the sleeping face of his daughter. He realized the boy from economy had done more than the unthinkable. He hadn't just silenced a cry. He had taught a father how to truly listen, and in doing so, had composed a future where the most complex problems might just be solved, not with data or with dollars, but with a song.